My name is Josephine Hale. Everyone calls me Jo. I'm 33 years old, and for most of my life, I was the daughter nobody bothered to introduce properly. Not because anything was wrong with me, because I was quiet, and quiet children are easy to forget in a family that runs on performance. 6 weeks ago, my grandmother died. 4 weeks ago, my brother forged her signature on a document meant to strip me of everything she left me. He made one mistake. He forgot what I do for a living. Before I tell you how it all came apart in front of 200 people at a charity gala my grandmother spent 30 years building, I want you to sit with me for a moment in the beginning, because you need to understand exactly how long this had been coming. If this story pulls you in the way I think it will, take a second now to like this video and subscribe. We post a brand new silent victory story every single day, and I'd love to have you back tomorrow. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. I grew up in Millbrook, a small town built around a single main street, a courthouse, and my grandmother's business, Hale and Daughters Restoration, a 100-year-old workshop that repaired antique furniture, oil paintings, and rare documents for museums, universities, and private collectors up and down the East Coast. My grandmother, Vivian Hale, founded it with her own mother in the 1970s, back when almost no women ran conservation studios of their own. By the time I was born, it wasn't just a business, it was an institution. People flew in from 3 states away to have Vivian Hale personally examine a 200-year-old letter or a water-damaged painting. My parents divorced when I was 5. My father moved to Ohio and became, over the years, a scheduled phone call twice a year and a Christmas card that arrived in February. My mother, Carol, remarried when I was 8 to a man named Gregory Voss, an insurance executive with a booming laugh and absolutely no patience for children who didn't perform for him. Nathaniel had a son from his first marriage, Nathaniel, 2 years older than me. And from the moment our 2 households merged, the architecture of favoritism was already poured in concrete. Nathaniel was easy to love in the way a firework is easy to love. Loud, charming, quick with a joke, quick with a compliment that always seemed to land exactly where an adult's ego needed it to land. I was the opposite. I read. I noticed things. I remembered things people said, sometimes for years, which made me either useful or uncomfortable to be around, depending on how honest the person wanted to be that day. My mother chose Nathaniel early and never looked back. It wasn't dramatic, it was structural. When Nathaniel broke curfew, it was boys will be boys. When I came home 4 minutes late from a study group, I lost my phone for a month. When Nathaniel failed a class, my mother called the school to advocate for him. When I got into an accelerated program in 8th grade, she asked if I was sure I wanted to make things harder for myself. The clearest memory I have of that era was my 15th birthday. My mother forgot it entirely, genuinely forgot. No cake, no acknowledgement, because she was consumed with planning Nathaniel's 17th birthday party 3 weeks later. A rented hall, a live band, 60 guests. When I mentioned, carefully, that my birthday had passed without a word, she looked at me like I'd said something faintly embarrassing. Don't make this a competition, Josephine. You're not like that. I wasn't like that. That was true. I had simply learned very young that noticing my own hurt out loud got labeled as jealousy. So eventually I stopped noticing it out loud at all. I just filed it away. I've always been good at filing things away. It turned out to be, eventually, the most useful skill I ever developed. The one place I never felt invisible was my grandmother's workshop. Vivian Hale did not do favoritism. She did precision. From the time I was 7 years old, she'd let me sit at the corner table in her studio on Saturday mornings while she worked, teaching me how to hold a bone folder, how to identify the difference between a fiber-based photograph and a chromogenic print. The ink from 1850 ages differently than ink from 1990 because of what was in it, iron gall versus synthetic dye, the way each interacts with paper and light and time in ways that simply cannot be faked by anyone who knows exactly what they're doing. Paper doesn't lie, Josie, she used to tell me, tapping a magnifying loupe against her palm. People lie constantly. Paper tells the truth if you know how to ask it the right questions. I didn't understand at 7 that she was teaching me a philosophy as much as a trade. I understand it now. Nathaniel came to the workshop exactly twice in his life, both times because our mother insisted, and both times he complained the whole visit about the smell of the solvents and left early. My grandmother never said a word about it to my mother, but she looked at me once after the second visit and said quietly, "Some people were built to build things, and some people were built to admire the people who build things. You're the first kind, Josie. Don't let anyone convince you that's a smaller thing to be." I studied art conservation at Winterthur, then completed a fellowship in document and paper conservation at a major university lab, specializing in forensic document analysis, the science of authenticating signatures, dating inks, detecting for forgeries. I now work as a senior conservator at a regional archive, and I consult privately, including, for the last 6 years, quietly and unofficially for my grandmother's own studio, which she kept running well into her 80s with the help of 2 employees and more, with my long-distance guidance. Nathaniel became a wealth management advisor at a firm his father, Gregory, helped him get hired into. He wore good suits, he drove a car that cost more than my first 2 years of rent combined. He called our mother every single day, a habit that looked from the outside like devotion, and that I came to eventually understand rather differently. My grandmother died on a Tuesday morning in early spring. She had a stroke in her sleep, in the same house she'd lived in for 50 years, the house with the workshop attached to the back of it. It was 86. It was, by every account, peaceful. I got the call from her longtime studio assistant, Marguerite, who found her. I remember standing in my kitchen holding the phone against my ear long after Marguerite had stopped talking, staring at a coffee cup, feeling something enormous and shapeless settle into my chest. My mother called 40 minutes later. Her voice was already doing the thing it does, the performance of grief laid carefully over something colder underneath, something I couldn't name yet, but would come to recognize very clearly in the weeks ahead. "We need to talk about the estate soon," she said, less than an hour after her own mother-in-law had died. "There's a lot to sort out." I should have heard the whole story in that single sentence. I didn't yet. The will reading happened 2 weeks later in the office of my grandmother's longtime attorney, a sharp, soft-spoken woman named Renata Ford, who had handled Vivian Hale's affairs for over 20 years. My mother came, Gregory came, uninvited, though no one dared say so. Nathaniel came in a suit that looked freshly pressed for the occasion, which struck me even then as an odd thing to notice at your grandmother's will reading. Renata read through the preliminary items first, small bequests to Marguerite, to a local historical society, and a scholarship fund my grandmother had quietly endowed for young women entering conservation and restoration trades. Then she reached the core of the estate. To my granddaughter, Josephine Hale, I leave the entirety of Hale and Daughters Restoration, including all real property, equipment, inventory, and associated accounts, along with my personal residence at 14 Birchwood Lane and the remainder of my investment portfolio, to be held in her sole name. The room went very quiet. To my grandson, Nathaniel Voss, I leave my 1967 Aston Martin and my personal library. That was it. A car, books, nothing else. I felt my mother's stare land on me before I had time to process what had been said. Gregory's jaw tightened visibly. Nathaniel's face did something complicated. a flash of something raw before the charming mask slid back into place, a beat too slow. Renata, sensing the temperature of the room, added, "Vivian left a personal letter as well, to be read privately to Josephine at a time of her choosing. I have it in my safe whenever you're ready." I want to tell you one more memory before I move forward, because I think it explains more about that will reading than anything else could. When I was 22, fresh out of my undergraduate program, I spent an entire summer helping my grandmother catalog a private collection of Civil War-era letters a local historical society had acquired from an estate sale. It was tedious, meticulous work, hours spent under a loupe, cross-referencing handwriting samples, building provenance timelines letter by letter. Nathaniel was home from college that same summer, between his junior and senior year, having just been fired from an internship at his father's firm for reasons no one in the family ever fully explained, though I gathered, piecing together comments over dinner, that it involved expense reports that didn't quite add up. My mother threw him a "We Believe in You" dinner that August, complete with a cake to celebrate him figuring out his next steps. I remember sitting at that table, my hands still faintly stained with the archival gloves I'd worn all day, listening to my mother toast her son's resilience and thinking, with a clarity that surprised even me at the time, that I had never once in my life been thrown a dinner for simply doing my job well. Not for the summer internship I'd landed at a museum conservation lab the year before, not for the fellowship I'd later be awarded, just quiet acknowledgement, if that, usually folded into some comment about how nice it was that I'd found something to keep busy with. I didn't say anything that night. I never did, but I remember catching my grandmother's eye across the table and the small, knowing tilt of her head that told me she'd noticed too. She didn't say anything either, not then. She simply reached over, later, while my mother was in the kitchen, and squeezed my hand once, firmly, the way she did when words felt insufficient for the size of what she wanted to say. I think about that dinner often now. I think my grandmother had already begun, quietly, deciding what she would eventually do with her estate long before any doctor ever mentioned a stroke risk or an actuarial table. I think she'd been watching the two of us for years, weighing not who she loved more. She loved us both, genuinely, in her own particular way, but who had actually built something true with what they'd been given, and who had simply expected the world to keep handing them things because they'd always been told they deserved it. We drove home from the will reading in near silence. That evening, my phone didn't stop buzzing. My mother called first. "This is a mistake, Josephine. Your grandmother was not thinking clearly toward the end. You know that." I didn't know that. My grandmother had run a full inventory audit of the studio 3 weeks before she died, had corrected an appraisal error a junior conservator at a museum made over the phone, and had beaten me twice at chess the last time I visited, but I already understood, from decades of experience, that facts rarely mattered once my mother had decided on a narrative. She was completely lucid, Mom. "You always think you know everything because of your little job." There it was, the familiar dismissal, delivered in the same tone she'd used my entire life to describe a career that took me 11 years of education and specialized training to build. "Nathaniel has done so much for this family. He deserves a share of this. We all do." I asked her carefully what exactly she and Nathaniel felt they were owed, and owed for what. She didn't answer that question. She never did in any of the conversations that followed. The demand was never attached to a reason. It was simply assumed, the way water assumes it's supposed to flow downhill. Over the next 10 days, the campaign began, and it followed a pattern I recognized immediately from childhood, just with higher stakes. Aunt Deb, my mother's sister, called to tell me how disappointed Grandma would be to see the family torn apart like this, as if I was the one tearing anything apart by simply accepting what had been legally, deliberately left to me.
Gregory sent a long email, ostensibly on Nathaniel's behalf, outlining all the ways Nathaniel had supposedly supported our grandmother over the years, visits I knew for a fact that had not happened, financial contributions to the studio that had never existed because I was the one who reviewed the studio's books every quarter. Nathaniel himself was quieter than I expected, too quiet. He sent one text: "We should talk. Families shouldn't fight over money. Let's figure something fair." Fair, in Nathaniel's vocabulary, had always meant however much benefits Nathaniel. I didn't respond to any of it right away. Instead, I did what I do professionally when something doesn't add up. I started documenting. I saved every text, every voicemail, every email, organizing them by date in a folder on my laptop I labeled, with a bleakness that made me laugh once alone in my kitchen, "Family Matters." 3 weeks after the will reading, Renata Ford called me directly, her voice unusually careful. "Josephine, I need you to come into the office. There's something you should see." I sat across from her the next morning, and she slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. It was a document titled Amendment to Last Will and Testament of Vivian Hale, dated 11 days before my grandmother's death. It named Nathaniel as co-beneficiary of the studio and the Birchwood Lane property, splitting the estate 50-50 between us. At the bottom was my grandmother's signature. "This arrived at my office yesterday, hand-delivered by a courier retained by your mother's attorney. They're arguing it supersedes the original will since it's dated later." I looked at the signature for perhaps 4 seconds before something in my stomach went cold and very still. "This isn't her signature," I said. Renata's eyebrows lifted slightly. "You're certain? Quickly?" "I've spent 6 years authenticating my grandmother's signature for insurance writers, loan documents, museum consignment paperwork. I know her hand the way I know my own." I turned the page toward the window light, angling it the way she'd taught me to angle documents decades ago in that workshop. "Look at the pressure pattern on the capital V. My grandmother had early-stage arthritic changes in her right hand for the last 4 years. It affected her signature in a very specific way, a slight hesitation stroke right after the initial downstroke, almost invisible unless you know to look for it. It shows up in every document she signed since 2021. I pointed. "It's not here. This signature is too fluid, too confident. Whoever wrote this was tracing an old signature, probably from a document predating her arthritis, and they didn't know to account for the tremor." Renata was quiet for a long moment. Then she leaned back slowly in her chair, studying me for a moment with an expression I couldn't quite place, something between relief and quiet sorrow, the look of someone who has spent decades watching families destroy themselves over exactly this kind of document, and has learned not to be surprised by any of it, only occasionally moved by who ends up telling the truth in the end. "Your grandmother told me once, years ago, that if anything like this ever happened, you'd be the one to catch it." I didn't fully understand what she meant until just now. "She taught me everything I know about reading paper." I said, "It makes sense she'd trust me to read this one too." "There's a process for this," Renata said, straightening, all business again. "We'll need a certified forensic document examiner to formally corroborate your findings. The court won't simply accept your professional opinion alone, even with your credentials, given your personal stake in the outcome. But if your analysis holds up under independent review, and I suspect it will, this isn't enough to defend the original will. It's enough to refer this to the district attorney's office for forgery charges, if that's a road you're prepared to go down." I thought about my grandmother's tremor, that one small, honest imperfection that unraveled an entire fraud, and I thought about how long she must have lived quietly with the accumulating suspicion that the grandson she'd given every benefit of the doubt to for 30 years might eventually do exactly this. "I'm prepared," I said. "I think she would have wanted me to be." I need to pause the story here for just a moment because I think a lot of you know exactly this feeling. The moment you realize the people who are supposed to protect you have instead decided you're simply an obstacle standing between them and something they want. If you've ever felt that particular kind of cold clarity, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. And if you want to see exactly how this forged signature came apart in front of the very people who created it, make sure you're subscribed because what happened next is the reason I'm telling you this story at all. I spent the next 2 weeks building a case the way I'd build one for a museum client disputing a forged provenance document, except this time the forger was my own brother and the victim was the grandmother who taught me how to catch people exactly like him.
I ran the amendment through spectral imaging at my archives lab, using equipment normally reserved for authenticating historical manuscripts. Under infrared and ultraviolet light, the ink told its own story, exactly as my grandmother always promised it would. The ink on the amendment was a ballpoint gel formulation that hadn't existed in the specific pen line my grandmother used until 8 months after the document's stated date. A small detail, the kind only someone deeply embedded in the world of writing instruments and forensic dating would catch. And I happened to be exactly that person, because Vivian Hale had spent 30 years teaching me to notice exactly these details. The paper itself was a slightly different stock than the letterhead Renata's office used for legal documents at that time, a subtle variance in brightness and fiber composition that a general audience would never notice, but that showed up unmistakably under raking light analysis. And then there was the notary stamp. The amendment claimed to have been notarized by a notary named Patricia Cole. I called the number listed for her office. It had been disconnected for over a year. I found, through a simple public records search, that Patricia Cole's notary commission had expired 14 months before the document's stated signing date. Whoever created this amendment hadn't just forged a signature, they'd forged an entire chain of legitimacy around it, assuming, correctly for most of their lives, that no one would ever check closely enough to notice. They had simply never had to contend with someone whose entire profession was noticing. I brought everything to Renata. She brought in a second independent forensic document examiner to corroborate my findings, a formality required for any legal challenge, and he confirmed every single conclusion I'd reached, adding one detail I'd missed: microscopic fiber transfer on the amendment page, consistent with it having been photocopied and re-signed from a template, rather than an original document ever having existed in Vivian Hale's handwriting at all. This is enough to not just defend the original will, Renata told me, sitting back in her chair, steadying me with something between admiration and concern. This is enough to pursue criminal charges for forgery and attempted fraud if you choose to go that route. I thought about that for a long time. Part of me, the tired, quiet, 7-year-old part of me that had spent her whole childhood being told not to make a scene, wanted to simply let Renata handle it privately, quietly, through the courts, and never look my mother or Nathaniel in the eye again. But then I thought about my grandmother, about the letters still waiting for me in Renata's safe, about 30 years of a business built on the idea that truth, patiently and precisely uncovered, always matters. And I thought about the fact that my family had spent my entire life training everyone around them to underestimate exactly the person who was about to prove them catastrophically wrong. I finally opened my grandmother's letter the week after the forgery was confirmed. Her handwriting filled 2 pages, the tremor unmistakable now that I knew to look for it, evidence of her own hand even in this most private of documents. My dearest Josie, if Renata has given this, it means I'm gone, and it likely means something has already started, because I know my daughter, and I know what she's capable of when she wants something. I've watched Carol and Gregory build Nathaniel up his entire life, like a monument, and I've watched them treat you like the caretaker of that monument instead of a person in your own right. I never said anything while I was alive because I didn't want to make your relationship with your mother any harder than it already was. That was a mistake. I should have said something a long time ago.
I did not leave you the studio because I felt sorry for you, Josie. I left it to you because you are, without question, the most capable person I have ever trained, and because you love this work the way I loved it, not for what it gives you, but for what it protects. Truth, memory, the things that get lost when nobody bothers to look closely. I know Nathaniel. I know that if there's any way for him to take what isn't his, he will try, quietly, and he will expect you to simply absorb it, the way you have absorbed every unfairness in that family since you were a little girl. Don't absorb this one. I also want to tell you something I never told anyone outside this letter. 3 years ago, I discovered irregularities in the accounts of the Hale Family Foundation, the small charitable trust I set up decades ago to fund art restoration scholarships and a children's literacy program at the Millbrook Library. Nathaniel has served as the foundation's unpaid treasurer since he was 26, a position I gave him, foolishly, hoping it might give him some purpose beyond his father's approval. I found discrepancies I couldn't fully explain at the time, small at first, then not so small. I was building a file. I never finished it before I died, but Marguerite knows where it is, in the studio's fireproof cabinet, second drawer behind the appraisal ledgers. I don't know what you'll find there, Josie. I hope I'm wrong about it all, but if I'm not, I trust you, more than anyone alive, to find the truth in it and to know what to do with it. You were never the quiet one because you had nothing to say. You were the quiet one because you were always the one actually paying attention. That is not a small thing to be. It never was. I love you. I'm so proud of the woman you became entirely on your own, with almost no help from the people who should have given you the most. Go build something true. By Grandma. I sat with that letter for a long time before I finally called Marguerite. Marguerite met me at the studio the next morning before it opened, her eyes red-rimmed, a woman who had worked beside my grandmother for 18 years and clearly hadn't slept much since her death. She led me to the fireproof cabinet in the back office, the one my grandmother used for the studio's most sensitive appraisal records, and pulled out a slim folder from behind a row of ledgers. Inside were bank statements for the Hale Family Foundation going back 4 years, several pages annotated in my grandmother's careful handwriting, sticky notes flagging specific transactions with question marks and dates circled in red. She started pulling these about 3 years ago, Marguerite said quietly. She never told me exactly what she suspected. She just asked me to help her request copies quietly, a little at a time, so it wouldn't look strange to the bank or draw attention. I think she was scared of what she'd find. I spent the next several days doing what I do best, reading documents slowly, patiently, cross-referencing dates and figures the way I'd authenticate a disputed provenance file. What emerged was not subtle once you knew where to look, though it clearly had been designed to be invisible to anyone who wasn't looking closely. Over roughly 6 years, the Hale Family Foundation had made a series of administrative disbursements and consulting fee payments to a company called Voss Advisory Solutions, LLC, a business entity registered, I discovered, through a simple state corporate filing search, to Nathaniel Voss himself. A business with no listed employees, no public services, and no visible activity beyond receiving payments from a children's literacy charity his own grandmother had founded. Payments started small, $400 here, $600 there, and grew steadily larger as the years went on, eventually totaling just over $140,000 diverted from a fund meant to provide literacy scholarships and restoration apprenticeships to underprivileged kids in Millbrook. I found matching charges on Nathaniel's own credit card statements, which Marguerite, feeling by this point that loyalty to Vivian's memory outweighed any discomfort about what she was uncovering, helped me trace through a set of old expense reimbursement records the studio had processed years earlier when Nathaniel briefly and unsuccessfully tried working part-time in the studio's front office as a teenager. The spending patterns lined up with the timing of several of the consulting withdrawals almost exactly. A boat down payment, 2 luxury vacations, a watch that cost more than most of the literacy program's annual scholarship budget. I spent 3 straight evenings after the studio closed, sitting at that back office desk, spreading years of bank statements across the surface my grandmother used to use for laying out disputed documents, and I found myself falling into the same rhythm she'd trained me into since childhood. Start at the edges, work towards the center. Never assume you understand a pattern until you've traced it all the way through. The foundation's transactions were organized by fiscal year, and once I built a simple spreadsheet cross-referencing every disbursement over $500 against its stated purpose, the shape of what had happened became impossible to unsee. In the foundation's second year under Nathaniel's stewardship, the payments to Voss Advisory Solutions were modest and infrequent, 3 payments totaling just under $2,000, each one logged under a vague line item my grandmother's old bookkeeper had apparently accepted without much scrutiny, trusting, as everyone always seemed to, that Nathaniel's easy confidence meant everything was in order. By the 4th year, the payments had become monthly, growing from $400 to over $2,000 a disbursement, always carefully kept just under the threshold that would have triggered a mandatory itemized review under the Foundation's own bylaws, a threshold, I realized, with a slow, sick understanding that Nathaniel had helped write himself, back when our grandmother, trusting him completely, had asked him to help modernize the Foundation's financial policies.
I found one email, buried in an old shared drive Marguerite still had partial access to from her years helping with the Foundation's administrative work, in which Nathaniel had written to the bookkeeper, almost breezy in tone. Let's just fold the vendor payments into general ops for simplicity's sake going forward. No need to complicate the year-end report with too many line items. Grandma trusts me to handle this stuff. I read that line 4 or 5 times. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even particularly clever. It was simply the quiet, practiced confidence of someone who had spent his entire life learning that charm was usually a sufficient substitute for scrutiny, because no one who mattered had ever bothered to apply any. I sat in my grandmother's old office chair, surrounded by 4 years of quietly, meticulously gathered evidence that she had begun collecting entirely on her own, likely already sensing what her golden grandson had become, and unwilling, even then, to believe it fully without proof. And I understood, finally, completely, what she had meant by go build something true. I called Renata. I called a forensic accountant she recommended, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Priya Anand, who specialized in non-profit fraud investigations. Within a week, Priya had independently confirmed everything in my grandmother's file and identified several additional discrepancies neither of us had caught, a pattern of reimbursements for Foundation events that had never actually taken place. While all this was happening, my mother's campaign against me hadn't slowed. If anything, it accelerated, because Renata's office had by then formally rejected the forged amendment and notified my mother's attorney that the original will stood unchallenged, pending the outcome of a forgery investigation that could result in a criminal referral. My mother called me 11 times in 3 days. Aunt Deb sent a message accusing me of using Grandma's death as an excuse to punish this family for imagined slights. Gregory left a voicemail. His booming insurance executive voice dialed all the way up to threat, informing me that Nathaniel had connections and that I would regret dragging this family's name through the mud over a piece of paper. I saved every single message. I always do. Nathaniel, notably, said almost nothing directly to me during this period. He was, I would come to understand, far too busy trying to figure out how much I actually knew. The one call I did answer, from my mother, 3 weeks after the forgery had been rejected, is one I still think about often. "You've ruined everything," she said, her voice shaking. Not grief, I realized, but with something closer to panic. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Nathaniel is..." She stopped herself. "Nathaniel is what, Mom?" Silence stretched long enough that I almost thought the call had dropped. "He's under a lot of pressure," she finally said. "He made a mistake with the paperwork. People make mistakes when they're grieving. You, of all people with your job, should understand that documents can be misinterpreted." "Mom," I kept my voice level, the way Renata had coached me to. The way 6 years of forensic authentication work had trained me to stay calm in the face of people trying very hard to convince me that what I could clearly see with my own eyes wasn't real. I didn't misinterpret anything. I proved in a lab with instruments that the amendment was forged. I can show you the ink dating. I can show you the notary's expired commission. This isn't a feeling I have, it's evidence. Another long silence. Then, very quietly, my mother said something that told me everything I needed to know about how much she'd already known and for how long. He said you'd never be able to prove anything. He said you'd never actually look that closely. That was the moment I finally understood, completely, that this had never simply been Nathaniel acting alone in a moment of grief-driven poor judgment. My mother had known. Maybe not every detail, maybe not the full scope of what I would eventually find buried in the Foundation's books, but she had known about the forged amendment before it was ever delivered to Renata's office. She had banked, quite literally, on the assumption that I would never look closely enough to catch it. She had spent 33 years training herself and everyone around her to believe I was the daughter who noticed nothing, who wanted nothing, who would simply accept whatever scraps of attention and inheritance the family deemed appropriate for someone like me. She had no idea what she'd actually raised. 2 weeks later, an invitation arrived at my grandmother's studio, forwarded from an old mailing list address, for the Hale Family Foundation's annual Spring Gala, an event my grandmother personally hosted every year for 3 decades, honoring the year's literacy scholarship recipients and restoration apprentices, held in the ballroom of Millbrook's historic Carrington Hotel. This year's gala, the invitation explained, would double as a memorial tribute to Vivian Hale's life and legacy. Nathaniel, as the Foundation's treasurer, was listed as the evening's host. I called Priya, I called Renata, and I made a decision my grandmother would have understood better than anyone. I RSVP'd yes. I need to stop again for just a second because I want to ask you something honestly. If you found out someone had been quietly funneling money away from a children's charity your own family built, money meant for kids who needed it, while also trying to steal your inheritance through forgery, would you have confronted them privately, or would you have wanted the truth to come out where everyone could finally see it? I genuinely want to know what you'd have done. Tell me in the comments. And if you want to see exactly how this played out at that gala, in that ballroom, in front of 200 people who thought they knew exactly who Nathaniel was, stay with me, because we're getting there now. And don't forget to hit subscribe so you don't miss tomorrow's story. The Carrington Hotel's ballroom looked exactly as it had every spring for as long as I could remember. Chandeliers, my grandmother used to joke, were older than the hotel's official founding date. Round tables draped in cream linen. A small stage at the front, where every year she would stand and read the names of the year's scholarship recipients, her voice thick with the particular pride of someone who had built something lasting out of nothing but patience and skill. This year, a large framed photograph of her sat on an easel near the stage, ringed with white flowers. Nathaniel stood beside it in a charcoal suit, shaking hands, accepting condolences, playing with practiced ease the role of the grieving grandson carrying her grandmother's legacy forward. I arrived with Renata and Priya sitting quietly at a back table, and at Renata's suggestion, a licensed private investigator named Frank Boyle, who had helped Priya corroborate the final piece of the financial trail 2 days earlier, a signed statement from the bookkeeper who had processed several of the Foundation's disbursement requests, confirming that Nathaniel had directed her on multiple occasions to code the Voss Advisory Solutions payments under a general operations line, specifically so they wouldn't appear as a separate flagged vendor in the annual audit. My mother spotted me almost immediately. Her face went through several emotions in quick succession before settling into a brittle, performative smile as she crossed the room towards me. "I'm glad you came," she said, too brightly, glancing past me at Renata and the unfamiliar faces at my table. "It means a lot that you'd honor your grandmother this way." I'm honoring her exactly the way she'd want. She didn't ask what that meant. I think on some level she already suspected.
The evening proceeded through its usual rhythms: a welcome speech from the hotel's events coordinator, a tribute video assembled from decades of photographs of my grandmother in the studio, in the workshop, at past galas, her hands always slightly stained of the particular ink and varnish of her trade. I watched Nathaniel move through the room, working it the way he'd worked every room his entire life, and I felt something steady settle into my chest. Not anger exactly, something closer to clarity. Near the end of the evening, Nathaniel took the stage to deliver the foundation's annual remarks, a tradition my grandmother had always handled herself, now inherited, in every sense of the word, by the man who'd spent 6 years draining the fund she built it from. He spoke well, he always did. He talked about legacy, about his grandmother's generosity, about his own commitment to carrying her mission forward with total integrity, a phrase that made Priya beside me exhale something close to a laugh through her nose. He announced this year's 3 literacy scholarship recipients, teenagers from Millbrook's public schools, who stood, visibly moved, as the room applauded them. And then, as he began to close his remarks, thanking everyone who has trusted this foundation with their generosity over the years, I stood up. Renala had coached me carefully on this moment, had asked me twice if I was sure I wanted to do this way, in public, rather than through the quieter, more conventional channel of a private legal filing. I had told her the same thing both times. My grandmother built something out of truth, transparency, and 30 years of showing up for this town in the open, in daylight, where everyone could see her work. Nathaniel spent 6 years hiding what he'd done in the dark. I wasn't interested in letting him keep hiding.
Before everyone leaves tonight, I said, my voice carrying more steadily across the room than I expected it to, I'd like to say a few words about my grandmother's legacy as well, if that's all right. A ripple of polite, mildly curious applause. Nathaniel's smile flickered, just slightly, uncertain but not yet alarmed. My mother, 3 tables away, had gone very still. I walked to the front of the room, Priya's folder in hand, and I told the room the truth, the way my grandmother had taught me, patiently, precisely, letting the evidence speak for itself rather than raising my voice or reaching for drama I didn't need. I told them that 6 weeks after my grandmother died, a document surfaced, claiming to amend her will, splitting her estate with a grandson she had specifically, deliberately, and legally chosen not to include as a beneficiary of the studio and property. I told them that forensic ink dating proved the document was created using a pen formulation that didn't exist until 8 months after its claimed signing date. I told them the notary listed on the document had an expired commission over a year before the alleged notarization. I told them, calmly, that I had the full forensic report available for anyone who wanted to review it, including, I said, looking directly at my brother for the first time all evening, the family members who had known about it before it was ever filed. The room had gone completely silent. Nathaniel's face had drained of color, the charming mask finally, visibly cracking. "That's not," he started, his voice unsteady in a way I had genuinely never heard from him before. "This is a private family matter, Josephine. This isn't the place." "You're right, it isn't. Neither is this." I opened the second folder. I told the room, still calm, still measured, that a forensic audit of the Hale Family Foundation's financial records over the past 6 years had identified a pattern of disbursements totaling approximately $141,000 paid to a company registered solely to Nathaniel Voss, disguised in the Foundation's books as general operations expenses, to avoid appearing as a flagged vendor in the annual audit. I told them these funds came directly from the Literacy Scholarship and Restoration Apprenticeship Program my grandmother had spent 30 years building for the children of this town, the very children whose names Nathaniel had just finished reading aloud from that stage minutes earlier. Someone near the front gasped audibly. A man I recognized as a longtime board member stood up, his face rigid with fury, and said, "Is this true, Nathaniel?" Nathaniel didn't answer. He was staring at me, and for one brief, unguarded moment, I saw something in his face I'd never seen there before in 30 years of watching him perform charm for every room he ever walked into. He looked, finally, exactly as small as the thing he'd actually done. My mother stood up so fast, her chair nearly toppled. "This is a lie," she said, her voice cracking, too loud for the silent room. "Josephine has always been jealous of her brother. She's always—" "Mom," I turned to face her directly, and something in my voice must have carried the full weight of 33 years because she stopped talking. "You told me, on the phone, that Nathaniel said I'd never be able to prove anything, that I'd never look closely enough to catch it. You knew about the forged amendment before it was ever delivered." I looked around the silent, stunned ballroom, at the scholarship recipients standing frozen near the stage, at the board members whose faces had shifted from confusion to a slow, dawning horror. I have that conversation recorded. I have the forensic report. I have 6 years of financial records. Everything I've said tonight can be independently verified by anyone in this room who wants to look. Frank Boyle, the investigator, stepped forward at that point, quietly, professionally, and informed the Foundation's board chair that he'd already been retained to file the case with the District Attorney's Financial Crimes Unit, and that copies of the full forensic package would be made available to the board's legal counsel first thing the next morning. Nathaniel didn't wait for the rest. He walked off the stage without another word, pushing past the tribute photo of our grandmother and out through the ballroom's side exit, my mother and Gregory hurrying after him, Gregory's booming voice reduced, for the first time I'd ever witnessed, to a low, urgent murmur trying and failing to manage a situation that had entirely outgrown his ability to control it. The room stayed quiet for a long moment after the door swung shut behind them. Then, slowly, the Foundation's board chair walked over to me, extended her hand, and said quietly, "Your grandmother would be so proud of you tonight. I'm so sorry it had to happen this way, but thank you, genuinely, for making sure it happened at all." I want to pause here one more time because I want to ask you something I've thought about a lot since that night. Do you think Nathaniel ever really believed he'd get away with it? Or do you think some part of him always knew it would eventually catch up with him? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you're invested in how the rest of this played out, the criminal case, my family's fallout, and what I found waiting for me back at my grandmother's workshop, make sure you're subscribed because the ending of this one is worth staying for. The criminal case moved faster than I expected. With Priya's forensic accounting report, the bookkeeper's signed statement, and the Foundation's board's full cooperation, the District Attorney's Financial Crimes Unit filed charges against Nathaniel within 6 weeks, felony embezzlement from a nonprofit organization, along with a separate charge for the forged will amendment, which fell under the state's forgery and fraud statutes. His attorney tried to argue mitigating circumstances, grief, financial pressure from a lifestyle that had, it turned out, outpaced his actual income for years. The judge was not particularly moved. Nathaniel accepted a plea agreement rather than risk trial. 4 years, with restitution ordered for the full amount taken from the Foundation to be paid back to the literacy and apprenticeship program directly. My mother was never charged criminally. There wasn't sufficient evidence that she'd known about the embezzlement itself, only, as far as anyone could prove, about the forged amendment, and even that was difficult to establish beyond the recorded phone call, which her attorney successfully argued was ambiguous enough to avoid prosecution. But the civil consequences were their own kind of reckoning. Renata's office pursued and won a judgment against her for the attempted fraud connected to the forged document.
and the community fallout was, in its own way, harsher than any court sentence. Millbrook is a small town. Word travels. My mother stopped attending the church she'd gone to for 20 years. Aunt Deb, to my genuine surprise, called me 3 months later, her voice small in a way I'd never heard from her before, and told me she was sorry, that she'd spent so many years assuming I was simply the difficult, ungrateful daughter, because that was the story she'd always been told, and she never once bothered to ask whether it was true. Gregory and my mother divorced a year later. I don't know the specifics, and I've stopped trying to piece together the mechanics of a marriage that was never really my responsibility to understand. Nathaniel wrote me one letter from prison, about 8 months into his sentence. I almost didn't read it. I sat with it unopened on my kitchen counter for 11 days before I finally did. It wasn't an apology, really, not the kind that takes real accountability. It was mostly an attempt to explain, to contextualize, to make me understand the pressure he'd felt his whole life to be exactly as impressive as everyone had always told him he was. There was one line in it, though, that I've thought about many times since. I think I spent so long being told I was the special one that I never actually learned how to earn anything. You did. I didn't. I don't know when that became your fault instead of mine, but somewhere along the way, it did.
I wrote back once. I told him I hoped, genuinely, that he used the time to become someone different than the person who wrote that letter. I haven't heard from him since, and I'm at peace with that. I still run Hale and Daughters Restoration. Marguerite stayed on, and we've since hired 2 young conservators. Justice. The program my brother tried to quietly gut is now training the next person who will one day sit at that corner table my grandmother once let me sit at, learning to read the truth out of old paper and older ink. I live in the Birchwood Lane house now. I kept the workshop exactly as she left it. Her tools, her reference books, the particular smell of solvent and old paper that I don't think I could ever fully explain to someone who didn't grow up inside it. Some evenings I sit at her workbench with a cup of tea, working on some small restoration project, and I talk to her a little, the way you do with people whose voice you're terrified of forgetting. I don't know if she can hear me. I like to think, given everything, that she probably can. The Foundation Gala happens every spring still, now run by the board directly, with Marguerite and me both serving as advisors. Last year's scholarship class was the largest in the program's history, funded in part by the restitution payments finally making their way back into the account where they always belonged. I think about my grandmother's letter often, especially the line about being the one who was always paying attention. For a long time after everything settled, I found myself wondering whether that kind of attentiveness was a gift or simply a scar shaped like one, whether I'd become good at noticing things because it was who I was, or because a childhood spent being overlooked had trained me, out of necessity, to watch everything closely in case it was suddenly taken away. I've come to believe it's probably both, and I've stopped needing it to be only one or the other. Whatever its origin, it turned out to be exactly the skill my grandmother needed someone in this family to have, and I'm grateful, in a complicated way, that it ended up being me. Renata still handles the studio's legal matters, and we've become something like friends over the 2 years since the gala, occasionally getting coffee to talk about nothing related to wills or forgeries at all now. Priya, the forensic accountant, now consults for the Foundation's board annually, reviewing the books each spring with a thoroughness that would have made my grandmother very happy indeed. Eleanor, the board chair, insisted on naming the literacy program's newest classroom after Vivian Hale, a small brass plaque by the door that I still can't walk past without my throat tightening slightly every single time. I've also started, slowly, teaching Saturday mornings again, Not for family this time, but for a rotating handful of teenagers from the apprenticeship program, sitting them at that same corner table, showing them how to hold a bone folder the way my grandmother once showed me. Last month, one of them, a quiet 15-year-old girl named Priscilla, who reminds me more than I probably should admit out loud of myself at that age, asked me why I loved this work so much. I told her what my grandmother used to tell me. Paper doesn't lie. People sometimes do, for a while if you let them. But if you're patient and if you know exactly what you're looking for, the truth always eventually surfaces, whether anyone wants it to or not. She wrote that down in the little notebook she carries everywhere now. I recognized the gesture immediately because it's exactly what I used to do at her age, in that exact chair, believing even then that some truths were worth holding onto carefully enough to find again later. I'm not close with my mother anymore. We speak occasionally, brief, careful conversations that never quite become anything more than logistics. I've made peace with that in a way that took a long time to arrive at. The understanding that a parent who spends 30 years training you to disappear doesn't automatically become safe to be close to just because the people around her finally saw the truth. Some relationships, once the illusion is gone, simply don't have anything true left underneath to rebuild from. That's not bitterness, it's just honesty, the same kind my grandmother taught me to look for in every piece of paper that ever crossed her desk. What I have instead is a family I chose rather than one I was assigned. Marguerite, who calls me every Sunday just to talk. The board chair, Eleanor, who's become something like the aunt I never actually had. Two young conservators who ask their questions the way I used to ask my grandmother questions, at that same corner table, in that same golden afternoon light. If you're watching this and you've ever been the quiet one in your family, the one who noticed everything and was told again and again that your noticing was somehow the problem, I want you to hear this clearly. Being underestimated is not the same as being weak. Sometimes the people who spend their whole lives being overlooked are simply the ones who were paying closer attention the entire time, quietly building exactly the skills they'd eventually need to prove everyone wrong. My grandmother used to say, paper doesn't lie. I've come to believe people eventually don't get to either, not forever. The truth waits. It's patient, and sooner or later, if someone is paying close enough attention, it finds its way into the light. Thank you so much for staying with me through this one. It means more than you know to have you here. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to fight to be seen in your own family, or if you've ever had to learn the hard way that some people will only respect what they can no longer deny, I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. I'll see you tomorrow right here for another silent victory story. Until then, take care of yourselves.